So we have some time for questions. I would invite questions from the audience. Does anyone want to have a question? I have some questions. Does anyone else have a question besides me? Sir.
Yeah. So this question is directed to parents here. I just wanted to know whether or not there's maybe a support group. My mother's best friend has a son with autism, and I know one of the biggest sources of support for her is the fact that she knows a lot of parents that also have children with autism. Is there any like formal support group of parents that?
We are not members of one. There are lots of groups that form on an ad hoc basis to provide support. There are formal support groups, but they are also artificial.
No, what I have found is that there are support groups for the higher functioning parents, at least in our parents of higher functioning autistic kids in our community. They don't address the same needs we have. But I have a huge network, thanks to social media, of a lot of parents that I'm in contact with. And I also am working on this self-determination project with a lot of parents. So I know a good 30, 40 parents like myself in my community now. We help each other somewhat, but a lot of what happens is we're all comparing notes and there's a lot of commiserating. That doesn't get us really far.
Yeah, the other thing that support groups, and it's sort of interesting, our daughter used to go to a support group for siblings. And ultimately she said, I don't want to do this because all we have in common is the fact that we have siblings. And what the network that Mary has built up is about people trying to address particular issues and particular problems. But you also go to these meetings and you'll hear, there will always be one parent when you're trying to have a policy discussion who will raise their hand and say, yeah, but my kid needs tomorrow to be at. And that derails the rest of the discussion.
Let me ask a question about best practices, because I think we've all touched on this without using those words. What are some of the things that seem to really work? I invite any of you to comment on that.
Probably what I would say is not, because we could list what the best practices are, but to me the critical factor is how we operationalize them and how we do them. I've become a big believer in this thing called implementation science, which some of you certainly know about. And the construct, very simply, is that before you can implement, you have to figure out what it is. And so even though I didn't get into elaborate detail, in my state, what we have tried to do is to we've taken probably 10 to 15 practices that are evidence-based and developed a sequential model that integrates several state agencies that families and individuals direct. But again, it's the operationalizing of it in a very pragmatic way. One of the mistakes, just to go off on a tangent, that I think a lot of people make, I was interviewed by somebody a couple of weeks ago who said, so why don't teachers do employment? And my response was, because A, they're not trained, and B, they don't have time. And so you recognize that teachers ought to do what happens in school. Families need to know every piece of detail, as you certainly have learned, but then there are other things that need to be integrated in some way, shape, or form. So, I think all of the things that several of us referenced are the practices that have been proven to work, but it's really the operationalizing and the integration of them that I think is what makes them work or not work. Because, there's, again, that difference between working in a research paradigm versus working in somebody's real life. So that's the point, I guess, I'd make.
Stuart, can I comment?
Yeah, please.
So the question is about best practices, and it's a great question and a terrific response. From my perspective, with the background in community organizing and community development, I believe that the missing link or the uncharted territory in best practices is around community development and creating opportunities at the community level. So a lot of the thinking in research and policy hovers around how do we modify individual people's capabilities and behaviors and skills, which is certainly part of the equation, but it's not the whole equation. You could be ramping up perfectly implemented best practices in schools at the individual student level and still have a services cliff, still have an opportunity cliff if there aren't opportunities in the communities for people to step into. And so one of the things we're trying to work on at the A.J. Drexel Institute is this Promising Practices Initiative, which is partnering with really innovative, dynamic, community-based organizations that are experimenting with new ways of creating opportunities in employment and post-secondary education supports, community integration, social participation, community service, because if we're not also developing best practices around creating opportunities and investing in community development, then we're really missing half of the equation in my mind.
Yeah. Thank you. Joan, you used the word customization, and Paul, I'm familiar with your work, and your work shows that not everyone will have the same opportunities leaving high school, that the gradation on the cliff is greater for some than others. So I'm wondering what we do, or what should be done, what can be done to better address the needs of the most severely affected young people. I would invite any of you to address this, because we're going to see different outcomes, and we shouldn't forget the success stories. And Jonathan, I think what you've done is just remarkable. But we need to talk about a lot of different people with a lot of different characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I personally think that the emphasis on students developing self-determination and self-advocacy skills, and for families also to be advocates where we do person-centered planning rather than just kind of here's your IEP form and here's your transition plan and we'll see you later. So I think it's investing in those kind of initiatives, because I really feel that despite the gaps in services, it's really the families and the youth that really can make a difference to get that customized approach. I also believe, again, from some of my research, it does happen at the community level. And where we've seen things work really well is when people pull together and coalesce around key issues. They form, in research it's called a community of practice, where they all come together and have an equal say, having youth and families at the center, and they work towards creating more customized effective practices. I think one of the shortfalls in the research in secondary transition, based upon some of the federal emphasis, is on evidence-based practices. And I'm not against evidence-based practices, but there's levels of evidence. And I do think that we won't have all the answers in evidence-based practices. I do think that we have to allow some practices to emerge based upon those individual needs at the local level.
We also have to not make it a competition for services. What happens is when you start customizing and doing individualized stuff is that all of a sudden the person that is spending 4 hours with your kid is not available to anybody else for those 4 hours. So that and vice versa, that when that person is working with somebody else's kid, they're not available to you. We cannot be pitting people against each other for what are essential services, and we do that all the time.
Well, thank you. Are there any more questions? Anyone else have a question? Okay, I think what I was tempted to say that we're done, but we're not done. We're actually just starting. But thanks to all of you for participating, and we'll continue talking.